latitude, prevailing winds and ocean currents, mountains and the nearness to the sea. Things like that determine what we call the climate, determine what the climate of a place will be.
Welcome to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks with Antoinette Nestor
and Amy Munro.
Amy, hello. How was your birthday?
And my birthday was surprisingly nice, pleasant. My flatmates cooked a lovely meal for me. We all sat around and ate, and it was as good as any birthday in lockdown could be.
Excellent.
Yes, absolutely. How was your weekend?
Well, other than getting absolutely soaked, I think Sunday we had a very lazy Sunday and then just relaxing at home.
So who have we got this week?
Well, this week I spoke to two people. One of them is Professor Khaled Soufani from the Judge Business School, and the other person is Dr. Laurie Wright from the Science University. So Cal will be telling us all about the circular economy, and Laurie will be telling us about maritime issues and climate change.
That sounds amazing. The other person I wanted to go and talk to, that wasn't about maritime issues and wasn't related to World Oceans Day, but was very much thinking about the environment, was Dr. Ed Turner from the university's Department of Zoology. And we talked about insects and insect declines and what that might mean for the world and how we continue to live our lives in the future, which was really interesting. The other people we talked to this week were the runners-up in this year's Carbon Challenge competition with their idea for a game called City Jam. And I'll tell you more about that in the interview.
Fantastic. Well, here is a topic that I really enjoy, which is the circular economy. So I had a very good chat with Cal.
So we're here with Cal, and just for the record, Cal, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your career in the circular economy, please?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to talk about the circular economy. I'm currently the director of the Circular Economy Centre in the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. And this centre conducts basically research on circularity from a business model perspective. Given that we are based in the business school, it is very important that businesses, one, understand the concept of circularity, and two, explore how to best introduce a circular economy model in their basically operations. I have done quite a bit of research on the area of the circular economy over the past few years, and I looked at circularity from an operational perspective, and I looked at circularity with the team, of course, in the center from a financial perspective.
And what, in a few words, or sort of like whatever short way you can say, what is actually the circular economy?
Well, the circular economy is a system. I mean, it is made up of two words. There is a circular and there is an economy. The circularity aspect relates to the technical side of things, and that is to try and use as few resources as possible for as long as possible, and try and attempt to reuse the components, the material, and continuously extract value from them as a substitute to just extracting new material. So circular economy is something that will be different from the linear economy model that we've had over the years, and that is the linear economy is about the extract, manufacture, consume, and then dispose. That's a linear model. Circularity is to try and keep the materials, the components in the process of consumption and production for as long as possible and maintain the value.
And how did all this started? I mean, were there some proponents of this is the way the economy should work in order to help the environment, or how did it all happen?
I mean, the circular economy actually, as a concept, basically existed for many years. I mean, in actual fact, we've had the concept of what we call the cradle to cradle, and the cradle to cradle is about trying to learn from what we call our living system, the biological material, where nature becomes a very important example of how it just reuses, repurposes the material to produce things that nature produces. So it goes back to many years. I mean, in my opinion, different people have talked about circularity in different ways. But it is now that we're beginning to realize that a circular economy model has an impact on basically economics as a system, especially when it comes to efficiency and productivity. Because if you try to use the material in the economy for as long as possible, you are, in a way, increasing the efficiency and the productivity of the material. So this is going back to the cradle to cradle concept.
And with the current situation of the global pandemic, how do you see the circular economy emerging out of this? Like, is it something positive, or has it influence in any aspect, if you can say so at this stage?
Well, circular economy, I think many people have thought about it before the current situation that we are in, and during. But one of the things that we are observing from an economic perspective, and that is we will probably be going into some kind of recessionary mode, and there's a slowdown in the economy because of the current situation. And the question that arises, and that is, well, okay, if there's going to be investments in our economies, there's going to be investments in our infrastructure, there's going to be investments in our companies. The question is that what kind of investments are we going to have in order to achieve the growth that we want? And there is a lot of talk about what we call green growth. And green growth is important in the sense that investing in these kind of projects will help achieve the sustainability targets. And there is talks amongst companies, policymakers, academics, thought leaders, that the future, whether given this crisis or before it or after, is basically about achieving green growth, regardless. And that is in order to protect the air we breathe, the water we drink, the soil we have to grow our food. In addition, the energy we consume. These are the four elements of life, and we have to continuously think about these things.
And in relation to that, do you see any challenges for the future of the circular economy? Do you think that it's going to become more prominent and people are going to start talking more and more about it?
I mean, trying to introduce new business models or economic models will always have some challenges. I mean, the first challenge is basically something to do with building an awareness about the benefits of a model like that. So we need to make sure that every decision maker, whether they are consumers, producers, regulators, understand what circularity is. And this is one challenge. So increasing the awareness about circularity and the benefits relating to circularity. The other aspect is, I think it is also something to do with the changing of the behavior of consumption as well as production. For many years, consumers and producers have, they have been accustomed to a certain type of consumption practices. And companies are the same. And that is where I'm sure you've heard the concept of what we call planned obsolescence. And planned obsolescence is to produce something that will last for a limited period of time, and it will have some kind of a shelf life. Now, this has become part of the consumer as well as the producer behavior. And a circular economy might be one of the models which could potentially argue that the planned obsolescence might have to be reconsidered in a way that will continuously add efficiency and productivity to the economic as well as the business model system.
And recently on the media, we have seen calls for people talking about the donut economy, and that the donut economy should make a comeback. Is it the same as the circular economy, or is it slightly different?
No, the donut economy is, I mean, when you think about the donut economy is some kind of a visual framework for for sustainability in general. And what it does, I mean, which is a very interesting model. It's a very, very interesting model, and it does combine what we would call the concept of the planetary boundaries, and that is where the ecological system is there, with the social boundaries. So it is about sustainability, and it deals with the social aspects of, in other words, in any economy, what kind of a social foundation should we have, such as health, education, food, water, income, energy, and so on and so forth. But there is a linkage to the ecological boundary or ceiling that exists in there. So this is a bigger concept, and it's a concept that relates to sustainability. Now, a circular economy can be seen as one of the enablers to achieve sustainability targets, one of the enablers to achieve these what we call ecological targets, and even the issue relating to creating jobs and protecting our water, energy, and food, and so on and so forth. So they are different. I know they're circular in terms of shape, but they are different in terms of concept. So it is very important thing of the circular economy as an enabler, as a tool to achieve sustainability.
What about people doing recycling and reusing? Are all those part of the circular economy that people are doing it without realizing that they're actually contributing to the circular economy?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, actually, because many people are already practicing circular economy practices, let's say, and many companies actually follow some circular economy practices without calling them circular. Because when you think about the circular economy, there are a number of things that goes. If you're a company and you're regenerating, or if you're a consumer and you're recycling, if you optimize the operations, if you digitize, I mean, the process of digitization and online is part of circularity. Things relating to exchange, I mean, all of these things are already in existence, and they relate to a circular economy. And the idea is to try and minimize waste. Whatever is going to help us minimize waste will contribute to a circular economy model. Whether this waste is coming from the material aspect, the waste is coming in food, and whatever kind of waste, if it is minimized, this contributes to circularity.
Fantastic. In case you just joined us, this is Cambridge Zero Climate Talks with Antoinette and Amy.
And on the subject of how to reduce waste and the circular economy and how our cities may look in the future, Amy spoke to the runners-up of the Carbon Challenge competition, and this is what they had to say.
Today, I'm talking to Georgina and Victor, who are runners-up in this year's Carbon Challenge competition with their idea called City Jam. So hello, Georgina and Victor. Could you tell me whereabouts in the world you are at the moment? Are you still in Cambridge?
I'm Georgina. I do live in Cambridge at the moment. I work for technically for the university and for the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. I'm actually up in Sheffield at the moment, just on the border of the Peak District.
Hi, I'm Victor. I'm currently in London. I'm a PhD student at Cambridge.
What do you normally do in your day-to-day life?
I work for the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. And so I work specifically for a program that CCI manages called the Endangered Landscapes Programme. We're a grant-making programme, and we support large landscape-scale restoration projects all across Europe.
And Victor, you mentioned that you're doing a PhD in History and Philosophy of Science. Could you tell us a little bit about what that's about?
My work is primarily on artificial intuition in medicine. So I look at diagnostic software and how it can be used to augment, or in some cases supplant, the clinical reasoning of a human. So as it turns out, that's a much more difficult question to get at. It's very controversial, and there's a lot of talk about what role these applications can have in hospitals and in clinics. And as it turns out, answering that question involved going back a step and looking at intuition itself, because it's a term that gets bandied about a lot and then almost never clarified. And especially when you're talking about healthcare, it's incredibly important, incredibly dangerous area to be tweaking without more information. This idea that, you know, a doctor's intuition is an incredibly powerful tool. What does that mean? And if we're going to supplement or replace that, what are the implications? So my research looks at not just the role that intuition plays in medicine, but also the role that software can play in either augmenting sort of the intuitive processes or supplanting them entirely if it's better for patient care.
This year's Carbon Challenge competition was focused on the theme of gamifying decarbonisation. So that was really thinking about how approaches from the gaming industry or sort of game theory could be used to encourage decarbonisation at any systemic scales. So you both got involved in the Carbon Challenge on the same team, and I know you had other team members too, but what was your team's idea? How did that come into fruition?
Yeah, so this idea quite literally started as a scribble on a piece of paper. We'd been to kind of an ideas jam that you'd organised, and you know, you'd provide a number of different prompts to kind of stimulate ideas, and I think one of them was around travel. And for some reason, what popped into my head was this amazing photograph that I think is quite well known, and it shows you like the same street in a big city, and it shows you how much space is required for the same number of people all traveling in different ways. So it shows you the space that's taken up. If you say it's 100, it might be 100 people or something, you know, what does this street look like if you have 100 people walking? How much space does that take up? How much space is taken up with 100 cyclists, 100 people on a bus, 100 people each driving their own car? And obviously you're seeing that for the less sustainable options, like 100 people all in their own car, you're just seeing this hugely congested road, and you know, smaller space still if they're all in a bus, and then all if they're, you know, even more still if they're all walking. And so I guess my idea kind of stemmed from that, thinking that what if you had an actual game that people could interact with, the map and try and ease traffic congestion, I guess, which is why the initial name City Jam came from. And it just kind of snowballed from there, really. Once we got the team together and we said, well, what if we go a step beyond this? I mean, what are the actions that people are going to take in the Snap as a player? You know, what are these interventions that they're going to make? And so we thought about, you know, travel interventions at first. For example, you know, what happens to the map if you put a cycle lane in? What happens if I don't know, you introduce a tax on inner city parking or something like that? And it just kind of mushroomed from there, really, until eventually what we came up with was an idea of a decision-based strategy game where you kind of start a level as a governor, I guess. You've just been elected as a governor of a new town, and it's your job to improve the city, you know, the quality of life for your residents, to meet, I guess, to create a healthy environment for the city, as well as kind of making sure that the economy doesn't nosedive either. So you're trying to balance these three pillars of sustainability there, so the environment, society, and the economy. And the way that you do that is by choosing to make these different interventions, so there could be some environmental interventions. So that could be, you know, planting trees or introducing a cycle path, as I said, where improving the environment is your focus. It could be a societal intervention, which might be, you know, creating or restoring a public park for people's, you know, well-being benefit. Or, you know, there could be an economical intervention, which might be, you know, introducing a green bank, or you know, introducing a universal basic income or something like that. But the idea was that there would be trade-offs here. So if you were to introduce an intervention that benefited the economy, maybe there's also a societal benefit with that, but there's an environmental consequence, and vice versa. So I guess what we were really trying to demonstrate to people with this game was that, you know, these decisions that city planners and governors and you know, politicians have to make really aren't straightforward. They're not insurmountable, as Victor said, but they are difficult decisions, and complex. I guess fundamentally where I was really coming from with this game, and to be honest, what kind of engaged me in the challenge, in the competition to begin with, is this idea of gamification. So coming from a perspective of someone that already cares very deeply about climate change and what's happening to the planet, and what, you know, as someone who's not even 30 yet, is kind of looking at what their future might look like. You know, I feel like the common narrative with all of this is very doom and gloom. It's as though we're trying to, because we feel the desperation of the situation and the pressure, you know, against the clock here, that we're really trying to drive home kind of fear here, which it just doesn't work. You know, fear doesn't work on people. Shaming people into trying to change their behaviors doesn't work. So we really have to do something differently. And, you know, there's some interesting movements around earth optimism where people are trying to communicate the solutions that we have. I think we need climate change to be fun, which might sound ridiculous, but if you think about it, you know, there are so many other sectors and difficult things that we try and process as a society, in politics, in health. It's as though we can make jokes about everything as a way to kind of process things, except for climate change.
So moving on, so what do you think the future of your idea is?
I think there's a lot more that could be talked about with this game. You know, for the purposes of the competition, we came up with some ideas of what we thought interventions could look like for those three categories of environment, society, and economy. But if we were to take the idea further, I'd like to engage much more with a full range of experts, from, you know, your economists to your conservationists, social scientists, and what I'd love to do is just stick them all in a room together and for them to talk about, you know, all the trade-offs, and how that should be reflected in a game. We did have a couple of people in our team that had connections, and in fact our mentor was massively helpful, have connections with the industry. So if it was something that we wanted to explore, you know, for example, approach a publisher or something, I think that's possibly a possibility for us. I'm probably biased because I really like the idea of the game, but it would be good to, you know, if it was something that we wanted to take forward, it would be good to speak to a couple of publishers and just ask, you know, does this sound like something there's a market for, that people would be interested in playing? Because I think fundamentally, if they don't think it's going to be a fun or enjoyable game to play, then for me there wouldn't be much point in taking it forward. I think that's one thing you absolutely have to get right.
So your idea is in many ways about simulating what our environment could look like in the future and how we can interact with that environment. Do you think now's a particularly interesting time to think about what the future of our environment would look like?
I guess my feeling is that what I'd like to see is maybe a diversification of how we sell environmentalism to people. Because I think there's a sense that the people who should care about the environment should love nature. And that's great. But not everyone loves nature. Not everyone's going to love nature. And I think it'll be a failed proposition if the only way we can save the planet is if everyone likes going outside and everyone likes trees and everyone likes cute, fluffy animals. Tons of people don't care, but there's still a very compelling reason for them to care about the environment. And I think what we need to do is figure out ways in which we can get people to care by figuring out what motivates them, rather than by trying to change their underlying motivations, because that's just not going to happen. And as mentioned, I think it misunderstands how people's motivations are formed in the first place. So it can be very easy when you have a comfortable life, you have enough food on the table, you know, you have a warm bed, and then you start worrying about like the seals or something, or, oh no, like ocean levels could rise. Whereas there are places in the world where people are like, yeah, that's going to happen in 10 years, but I'm going to starve tomorrow. So, you know, I have different priorities than you do. So I think figuring out a way to make the problems, our collective problems, important to every person rather than trying to, export our cares and worries and motivations, I think is going to be the way forward. And there are some people who might just care about the environment because it's a cool, engineering problem for them to solve, and that's fine. We need to make it interesting for all the stakeholders, which is literally everyone on the planet, and that's the trick, how to do that. And be fine where two people are going to cooperate to save Earth, even though one of them actually doesn't even think it's that beautiful.
Brilliant. Right. I think we're pretty much coming to the end. Are there any final comments that either of you would like to make?
No, I think so. I think I rambled on for long enough, I think.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming on today. It was a delight to have you both.
In case you just joined us, this is Cambridge Zero Climate Talks with Antoinette and Amy.
Well, I look forward to seeing the app in operation. And I believe, Amy, you spoke to Ed. So I'm looking forward to listening to the chat you had with him.
So I'm talking to Ed Turner, who is a lecturer and curator of insects at the Museum of Zoology. So hello, Ed.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Why are insects relevant for the environment?
I'd say I work on insects, so I consider them the most important taxonomic group there is.
Of course.
But aside from that, insects, so E.O. Wilson, who's famous for lots of reasons, but wrote beautiful books for ants, described insects as the little things that run the world. And they really are in lots of ways. They're really important for underpinning loads of important ecosystem services, things like pest control, pollination. They drive decomposition and nutrient cycling, all of these kind of things that natural ecosystems rely on, and also human-dominated ecosystems rely on as well. So they support our crop production and everything else. Without insects, really the world would be a very different place, and it wouldn't function anywhere near as well as it does. And of course, we rely on it. I think the insects are also important just because of their sheer number of species. So they make up the majority of described animal species so far, maybe 900,000 to 1 million species of insects, with estimates going up to 8 million. And there's only about 1.2 to 1.4 million species being described in total, so about 3/4 are insects.
Brilliant. We talk a lot about climate change, but biodiversity loss on a massive scale is happening too. Are insects experiencing those kind of losses?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting time to ask. With the last couple of years, there's been a wealth of papers coming out showing not just that insect number of species is declining, but insect abundance and possibly biomass is declining as well. And the results are a little bit variable. So I think there's little doubt that insect diversity, number of species, if you like, worldwide is going down. And that's because of a whole range of different drivers. What seems to be popping out now, though, is that the abundance of even common things is going down. And that varies a bit from study to study. But actually, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a new publication came out which summarised lots of the literature and basically looked for long-term data sets right the way around the world. And they've reported, based on that, using, again, just long-term data sets, that there's been about a 9% decline per decade over the last few decades in abundance and biomass of terrestrial insects. So I think the consensus is basically yes, they are disappearing, unfortunately. The caveat to that is there's very few studies being carried out in the tropics, which is where insects, like everything else, are most diverse. And so it's mostly driven by Western Europe and by North America, really. But I think given that these are the areas that probably see the most severe habitat change, and that other places around the world are trying their very best to kind of catch up with us in that, we might expect to see these declines happening elsewhere, even if they're not already.
So that's really, really interesting. So it's not just necessarily being driven by habitat loss and increasing the area of land that we're giving over to farming. It's actually also thinking about how climate change itself is affecting these insect species and the effect it's having on their physiology.
Yeah, I mean, people haven't studied this in perhaps enough detail yet, but there'll certainly be an interaction going on there. And there's a few studies, I say, showing that insects in the tropics might be more vulnerable to that kind of stuff. And these things interact as well, right? So if you cut down a forest in wherever it is, Southeast Asia, and you convert it to an oil palm plantation, then you might be getting immediate temperature increases during the daytime of perhaps 7 degrees, 8 degrees, far higher than you might predict from global warming over centuries. And of course, if you've got global warming as well, that's even hotter. So you're getting changes which affect the temperature and affect individual insects happening instantly. And that's interacting with longer term climate change effects. So it's a perfect storm, really, in terms of reducing insect numbers potentially.
And what kind of impact will that have? Why does that matter?
Well, I mean, that's the question, is an insect is insect. How many do you need? I mean, the answer is probably as many and as diverse a community as possible, because insects do so much. I mean, I'd always take a step back from this. I think that insects are individually very, very beautiful. They're fascinating things to study, and they are incredibly diverse. So from that point of view, I think they're endlessly interesting. We don't perhaps pay them enough attention because they happen to be smaller than birds and mammals and things like that, and they look very different to us. But I think that when people start looking at them, they're really remarkable. So we should be interested in conserving them just simply because they're remarkable. I think they should also be interested in conserving them because each individual species is completely unique. It's unique in exactly the same way as an orangutan is unique, each individual insect species. It's just that we tend to assign greater value to larger things, and that's a mistake, I think. The individual species of insects are important just for that reason. But all of that aside, they are very, very diverse, and they are very, very, very abundant. And they are also responsible for underpinning lots of different ecosystem functions and services. So from a very selfish point of view, we probably want to conserve insects because of what they do. They're food for everything else because of their abundance. And they're also really important for lots of functions and services that we rely on, particularly to do with our crops.
So could you explain a little bit more about why insects are important for our crops?
So there's there's lots of things that crops rely on to basically to produce. Nutrient cycling is one side of it. So although we put on lots of nutrients and things like that, you need to have a reasonable soil structure, and there's more stuff going on than just that. Having nutrients turning over and things decomposing within the soil is really important, it turns out, for crop production. So they're important for that. They're important for the soil structure, so things like insect activity can increase the pore density and things like that in the soil. That means the soil's often got more water holding capacity. They can integrate organic matter. Again, that increases water holding capacity, increases plants' abilities to get hold of nutrients and things. For plants which are pollinated, lots of those pollinators are insects. So again, we can replace that. We can hand pollinate crops and things like that. They tend to be much less efficient. It's incredibly costly. It's hard to see how you could really replace that on a large scale. And of course, a lot of pests are insects. So that reduces crop yield. But a lot of pest control agents are also insects. So they're controlling insect pests too. So for all of these reasons, they're underpinning crops in lots of different ways. That's obviously, it's not additive, they're not all giving that additional value, but put those all together, and basically diverse insect communities might be rather important in supporting the crop production we rely on.
So moving on slightly, what can we do about these losses that are happening?
Well, with insects, we're in quite a good position for this. I mean, insects are basically very robust. They can, generally speaking, across species, they can generally reproduce quite quickly. They've generally got quite large populations. So it tends to mean they're quite resilient. So the fact we're beginning to see declines in abundance of insects in large parts of the world means that we can pat ourselves on the back of that. It's quite an achievement to be able to drive insects to low numbers. They're not like rare things. They're not like mammals and stuff like that. You've got a few individuals. The plus side is that if you start relaxing those things and you make a bit of space for insects, the chances are they probably will be able to bounce back. And that really, I think it probably all boils down to keeping insects a little bit more in mind when it comes to managing stuff. And I think that's managing stuff at the kind of policy level, national, in terms of how we manage our agriculture, how much land we give away to wildlife and everything like that. I think it can also, for individual people, come down to just how you manage your backyards or even your window blocks. Things like that can make a real difference to insects because they operate on a small scale. They're individually tiny but very, very numerous. So small tweaks to how we change the environment around us can have real world impact for insects. They really can.
So what would you recommend people do to their backyards and their window boxes?
Be less tidy.
Less tidy.
We do love a tidy garden, but perhaps we should try and appreciate an untidy one a bit more. So a bit of space. Sorry.
So I'm glad to hear that one of my flatmates' strategy of letting our garden go a bit wild over this summer has been a good one.
Yeah, wildlife gardening, that's the way to call it. You follow a wildlife gardening approach. It doesn't have to be everywhere. I mean, people kind of, people obviously have a lot of different uses they get out of their back garden. They'll leave the areas to kick balls around, all that sort of stuff. You've got kids or not. But I think you can still make space. You don't need tons and tons of room. So there's really simple tweaks, like when you're cutting the grass, don't cut all of it. Go back 20 years and people really like their kind of closely clipped lawns and everything like that. And Botanic Garden was all completely clipped lawns and things. Whereas now they've got large open grass areas, long grass areas, and they're some of the most popular things with the public, because they look beautiful. They're really, really nice. The experiment that kind of Kings has had this year with a patch of grass, letting it grow up and kind of the flowers and things like that, looks fantastic. And people could have that in their own garden very easily. So it's not an either or, I think. You don't have to have an aesthetically unpleasing garden to make space for nature. It can be both. And there's other tweaks as well. I mean, people tend to, if you've got borders and things, people tend to tidy up their borders in the autumn. Just leave it to the spring. So that's providing an overwintering site for a whole range of invertebrates, and also a foraging site for birds and those and other stuff. It's probably better for your plants too. So there's loads of things like that.
Brilliant. So moving on slightly, what research do you do when you're not curating insects?
So most of my job is research rather than working in the museum, and I've got a fantastic team, so I'm very lucky. We've got 3 main themes to the work we do in our group, which is the insect ecology group. One's related to work out in Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Indonesia, where we work with oil palm companies to basically find out ways you can manage oil palm crops to make them more diverse, particularly for insects, and what impact that has on function and yield. And what we're basically trying to do is work out ways that you can tweak the management for an oil palm plantation to not decrease yield, so it's still really, really productive, but it can be more diverse. And it turns out there's lots of things you can do which basically bring insects in without coming at a cost. In fact, sometimes coming with a benefit. In the UK, we've got a kind of group of researchers who are looking at butterflies. And with that, we work with the Wildlife Trust, the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire Wildlife Trust, the local flavour of wildlife trust, which has got fantastic reserves for butterflies across the 3 counties. And we're particularly interested in projects now looking at how butterflies respond to climate change. So particularly over the last probably 10 years or so, we've been taking butterfly temperatures and basically finding out which species are better at buffing their temperature in the wild and how they use microclimate and things like that to do it.
How do you take a butterfly's temperature?
Carefully, yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got a very, very fine temperature probe, like a little wire, which we catch the butterfly really quickly and have it in the net, and then you just touch it to its thorax, and it reads its temperature, and you let the butterfly go. We take other measurements as well, wing size and things. Yeah. It's easier than it sounds. And then the third bit of project we do is based very much on the curatorial stuff in the museum, and that's basically using the insect collections we've got in the museum to understand long-term habitat and environmental change through insects.
Brilliant.
Some really nice work at the moment looking at butterflies that have been collected in Cambridgeshire going back to about probably 1820, 1810, something like that. We've got collections and basically seeing how things have changed over time and the relative abundance shifts and stuff like that. And because insects have been collected for such a long time, and because people really, really like setting up their own butterfly collections in the day, we've got really good historical data for that. So we can it's the closest an ecologist, I think, can probably get to time travel.
Amazing. And actually you get into that thing of actually the whole problem where we have shifting baselines. So we think about the world as we grew up in it. We don't always necessarily understand that things were much, much more abundant 50 years before, 100 years before. And actually, I suppose those kind of records give a clue or give light to actually what those historical conditions might have been like.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So mostly when we talk about the study I mentioned right at the beginning, when we were talking about insect declines, they talk about long-term records. And I think their longest term records went to the 1930s, with the vast majority coming kind of like post-1980.
Yeah,
you know, that's when it mostly was. So really, we're not talking about that long-term records, because by 1980, and I can easily remember back to the kind of mid-80s, and you know, things were already pretty desperate then. So things will have changed a lot, and it's interesting because the message can go in both directions. Some species which we think of as declining loads, it turns out have actually been, you know, fluctuated lots. So you go back to the 1830s, they're even rarer. So it can go in both directions, but certainly having these long-term historical data can really help.
And the final question to ask is, do you see any reasons for hope in this area?
Loads, yeah, of course. I mean, it would be very difficult to work in this area if there wasn't hope. I think it's at times it's all we've got, but I think there is genuinely lots of reason for hope, and I think that's partly because number one, I think, is that people are more interested in the environment than they were in the past. I think we've really seen that in the last few years, especially with younger audiences getting much more involved, and that's absolutely crucial. If people don't care, then there's no chance of us conserving anything really. People do care, so we can. And I think that's true of younger audiences, it's true of the public. I think it's also true increasingly of agricultural producers as well. So these are the people who are managing large parts of the world for production, which is what they're paid for. But I think there's an increasing interest to do this for the environment as well. And I think that probably governments are also going to end up starting supporting it. It's the wrong way around, really. It's not really governments pushing it, it's rather the other way around. It's just slightly interesting. But I think there's real option for that. And certainly as far as insects are concerned, there are loads of things you can do. We're at a point where there's been an awful lot of loss in terms of species and probably in terms of abundance and biomass, as we were talking about earlier. But things can bounce back. If you get things right, you can reverse these trends. There's studies which have done just that. So it's just a question of having the will behind it, and that's the scientific will, the political will, and also the public will, and the knowledge to be able to do that.
Wonderful. This is Cambridge Zero Climate Talks. You can get in touch on our email address, which is info@zero.cam.ac.uk.
This past Monday, the 8th, was World Oceans Day. So I spoke to Laurie Wright. Laurie, thank you very much for joining us today. And for our listeners, can you please tell us your name and what you do, please?
Sure. So it's a pleasure to be with you and joining you today. My name is Dr. Laurie Wright. I'm a senior lecturer and lead for research in the Warsash School of Engineering at Solent University in Southampton. By background, I'm an environmental scientist, but I've, if you pardon the pun, kind of fallen into a maritime marine school where I'm working at the connection between marine engineering, logistics, industry issues and environmental impacts. So I'm really looking at those transition points between how do we create a much more sustainable shipping industry, maritime industry, a much more sustainable energy system that sits behind that, and various other issues such as waste in the cruise industry. So all these things, it's about the interaction of the industry and environmental impact.
So in relation then to climate change and the effects of shipping, do you have any data? Have you collected any data, something that you can share with our listeners?
Yes, so shipping, I always think of shipping as it's one of those industries that's actually fairly hidden. It's something we generally don't think about too much when we talk about climate change. And I think that is changing. We are talking about it more and more, but because it's international and it goes beyond country boundaries, we haven't really considered in the past. But it does make up quite a significant proportion of emissions, and in terms of countries. So for example, if shipping were a country, it would fit quite firmly in the top 10 countries in the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. However, saying that, it's also worth bearing in mind that the majority of stuff that we own, we use, the reason we can talk on our laptops today, the reason we have our radios, they're built all over the world, then they're moved by ship. So pretty much everything we ever come in contact with at some point in its life has been on a ship. So it's a vital component of our international trade system. And actually, it's one of the most efficient modes of transporting goods and services around the world on a per unit basis. So that is to say, per item of thing that we move, a ship is one of the most efficient modes of doing it. It's just the sheer scale of the ship that then makes it a problem in terms of huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. We're talking sort of about 2.5 to 3% of all global greenhouse gas emissions coming from these ships.
And now in relation to the current pandemic with COVID-19, have you been able to get any data of what has happened with the shipping industry?
Yeah, so there's some data coming out now, and it's fascinating in many ways, and also slightly shocking. So the shipping industry, when we look back, say in sort of January when it was first kicking off in China, there's an absolutely incredible crash in movements of ships. So if you look back, we took some data on I believe it's the 29th of December. We took a snapshot of all of the ships that are at sea at any one point, and there's about 190,000 ships at sea. So that doesn't account for smaller vessels that aren't being recorded, but that's just ships, and these are ships underway at sea. So it doesn't account for those at anchor. So it gives kind of an idea of the scale of the movement. But then you look at when the outbreak started to take effect. So you're sort of looking through January, February, and if we just look at things like crude tankers, so these are the tankers carrying crude oil around the world, the crash in the number of these tankers that were being under demand. So we were looking roughly, we measure it in terms of what we call daily cargo miles. So this is the number of miles a piece of cargo moves. So you're looking at about 3 billion cargo miles on average. It's an average day. By the middle of February, that was almost at zero. Phenomenal crash. Similarly, if you look at the cruise industry, the majority of cruise ships, as of a few weeks ago, are now anchored up, moored up, empty, and just sat there waiting for however we come out of this. It's, you know, the crash has been phenomenal. However, interestingly now, as we're seeing things like the Chinese economy beginning to pick up again and pick up pace, already we're beginning to see an uptake in shipping movements again. So it's already beginning to pick up and recover, I suppose, if you will. But I think the fascinating one is the movement of oil, where we now have companies actually paying to store their oil on oil tankers because they can't shift it fast enough.
That's right. So it's actually oil tankers storing oil in the sea somewhere.
Eventually acting as a storage capacity, because the demand for crude, I mean, it wasn't just COVID, there are other essence at play, I think, with that, with such as the conflict, when the Russian Saudi conflict in terms of oil price, we ended up in a sort of perfect storm of lots of excess supply, and then COVID-19, which smashed demand, and all of a sudden you're looking at a point where the oil price potentially goes negative, which is just practically unheard of, frankly. And it's led to a point where vessels are being used as storage until the demand picks up to then start moving it around the world again.
So should we hope that the demand doesn't pick up in relation to forward thinking and try to encourage more of a green recovery rather than going back to what it was before?
I hope so. I really do. I think COVID has perhaps in some ways given us a bit of a wake-up call of what the kind of action that needs to be taken, I think, for tackling climate change. But the way it's achieved it is by massive economic slowdown. I think at a kind of a personal level, I try to believe that we can address climate change in a way that allows for the economy to grow and for wealth creation and for people to progress. But I think it has given us an opportunity and a bit of a stopgap to rethink where we are and how we do things. And especially with something like shipping, an industry that is very conservative, it's very slow to react, very slow to change. The way it now comes out of this could be done in a way that is much greener. I mean, it could rethink the way we use fuels, the way we move product, so many things that could be rethought. And it's kind of given us that space to think about it a little bit. So I really hope so.
And within your own research, do you have any projects coming forward in relation to this?
Yeah, so we're kind of looking at a couple of things that are on this. And actually, the projects we're working on obviously started before we entered this situation. So I think it's kind of changed our thinking a little bit. But we're doing quite a lot of work looking at alternative fueling systems. So that is doing away with that very heavy crude oil residual product and saying, is there a, to use air quotes a little bit here, cleaner alternative? And we're kind of looking at that. So one of the things we've looked at is LNG, which is liquefied natural gas. So it's still a fossil fuel, but it's got a lot less of the impurities that heavy fuel oil has in it, for example. So it doesn't necessarily address all of the climate change consequences, but it does address a lot of the pollution implications. Now it's actually quite a proven technology because it's been used in gas carriers for the past several decades. But it's beginning to kind of filter through into other ships. So, for example, you're seeing it in a couple of cruise ships are using this fuel now. Car carriers are using this fuel. But the thing we found with that is it's less the environmental driver, it's a cost driver that is driving people to transfer into using that as a fuel, because it at the moment, or pre-COVID, it was cheaper than using heavy fuel oil. And it'll be interesting to see how we come out of this, whether the fuel price goes back up, and that's still the case. But it's an interesting stopgap technology. Looking further forwards, one of the other things we're starting to look at is hydrogen, which is, I think, getting a lot of traction right across the transport sector, right across the energy sector. And there's a lot of interest in shipping companies to see whether or not this is a viable fuel source for ships. So one of the projects we've got, we're looking primarily at what we would call short sea. So short sea is stuff that doesn't go very far off coast. It's only moving, say, between Rotterdam and Southampton. It's that kind of distance. It's not big stuff. and inland shipping. So that's things, barges, canal boats, those kind of things. And we're particularly looking at a couple of vessels in the Netherlands for this technology. The reason we're restricting ourselves in that way is hydrogen technology is not yet mature enough, I suppose, to provide the kind of fuel you need to go for something with a ship going to sea for 6 months. We just cannot replicate the energy you get out of a traditional fossil fuel based system in a way that is cost effective, safe, and practical. Has a lot of potential, and I think there's a huge push to try and move into those kind of technologies now, especially in the deep sea as well. And there's some push, for example, in ammonia. So using ammonia as a hydrogen carrying technology. So you're actually holding the hydrogen in the ammonium, which is then used to power your ship. So you're kind of getting to a point where you do have something that's equivalent to fossil fuel, but those technologies are quite a way off. I think you're looking probably another decade before these are really coming to fruition in terms of their use.
I think as consumers, sometimes we don't really think about how products are transported from A to B. And I think if people were more aware of how things were happening, people just don't really realize how much, for example, the whole shipping industry plays a role and how it works. I think it's the information you're giving us is truly eye-opening.
I think it's always one of those moments of sort of stopping and thinking where the thing that you've got came from, or the item we're consuming came from, because very little of what we consume is truly local, I suppose. Even products that we classify as being locally manufactured or locally sourced, probably somewhere in their supply chain have got something, be it a fertilizer ingredient or something like that has come from somewhere around the world. We live in a very globalized world, and I personally don't think we'll ever go back on that. I don't think it's possible. It's progressed our standing of living so far. It's allowed technological progress, but it's kind of realizing where our stuff does come from and how it's got to us. And I think the COVID element has actually highlighted that interconnectivity for us in so many ways, and the idea that actually now we are able to go online to a particular large retailer, for example, and within 24 hours something turns up on your doorstep. But that thing that's turned up on your doorstep may well have been manufactured in Southeast Asia. It may have been designed in America, and then it's been shipped to somewhere like the Netherlands, and then it's come across the UK, and then it's found its way to your house. And we don't really think about that whole process that's gone behind it. We think, okay, that thing maybe had it, the way it was manufactured is really important, but actually there's a whole transport network as well that underlies that process. And it is very easy not to see it, because most people, you don't see it. You just don't see ships.
Indeed. And on a more personal note, how did you become involved with all the vessel industry and maritime? Was it something that you were always passionate about? How did that progress come about? Because every time, for the listener that you could see your facial expression while we're talking on Zoom, just your face just lights up every time you talk about the whole industry.
So it's a funny one. So as I said, I started out as an environmental scientist, doing a lot of work on carbon emissions, climate change, those kind of things. I then went off and I worked for a waste company. And I think that was really my turning point in my life, was actually working on a landfill site, managing a landfill, and seeing the amount of waste that is tipped on a landfill is just unbelievable. We were tipping 24-ton trucks every 5 to 10 minutes full of waste. And I think I just had this moment of, there must be a better way of doing this. Really must be a better way of doing this. So I kind of went back in, and I ended up back in academia. And then almost, I suppose, a stroke of luck, being in the right place, but I joined Solent with quite a strong background in maritime, and just started talking to some of the people who were working in that industry, and just getting quite interested in it and understanding the industry more and more, and really kind of get my head around it. And that kind of combined with a bit of a childhood experience that I had, which was my father used to work for Trinity House, who were the lighthouse service. So I had this kind of stories of ships and shipping and how this industry works, all these people, and it was just sort of being thrown back into that and surrounded by it. It just became a really fascinating industry full of very, very passionate people, to work with very interesting people as well. And at the same time, you've then got this thing from an environmentalist perspective that is largely, or was largely, ignored in many ways and was out of sight, out of mind. People didn't really think about it. So it just formed a really nice niche, I think, for me just to sort of fit into, was to look at this and think, actually, how do we tackle this problem? A problem that isn't always in the public eye. Plastics, as an example, is always in the public eye, and it was something that was thrown to the forefront, and people want to do something about it. Shipping, it's this thing we don't really see, and actually, if you really get to the core of it, and you ask someone, well, okay, so would you be willing to accept a 2-week delay on your new TV or something, or would you give up this product to reduce the shipping? I'm probably guilty of it as well. I don't, I still want all the interesting foods I can buy in the supermarket. I still want all those products I can buy, and it's going to come on ships. So the way to fix it is to make the ships themselves cleaner, and that to me has been a real become a passion, I suppose. But the reason I think I sort of smiled and grinned a little bit was, despite all of that, the moment I set foot on a ship, and every time I've gone out to sea, I immediately get seasick, and I've never been able to overcome that. So, despite working in this industry for a number of years now, I still suffer quite severe seasickness. So.
Murphy's Law, isn't it? But Laurie, it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much. And if people wanted to learn more about what you do, and they want to get a little bit more into maritime issues, what should they do? Just Google your name, or just go a specific place?
You can do that. As I say, we have a couple of projects. So there is the implementation of ship hybridization project. So a nice catchy title, but if you Google that, you'll find some information on that project. We also have another one related, which is the Ports Energy and Carbon Savings Project, which again, just Google it, you'll find a lot of information. But that's about reducing the port side carbon footprints. There's a couple of really interesting issues there. There's also a lot out there. A lot of my colleagues are working in this issue as well. So if you just sort of go to the Warsash website, look at some of the research and some of my colleagues' profiles, you'll find a lot of information on there. So we're doing quite a lot of information on well-being of seafarers, especially at the moment. People aren't able to come off ship, so there's quite a lot of work going on in that. But just the Solent website, www.solent.ac.uk. From there, you can find me, get in touch if you like. My email's up on there.
So, Laurie, thank you very much. Hopefully, we'll be able to hear about your projects.
Yeah, been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's been really good. Thank you.
Amy, it was great chatting this week. It's all about water. Let's hope that the weekend is a bit drier than last one. Please tune in next Friday. We'll be having more insightful conversations about climate change, environment, and sustainability.
Chat to you next week. Cheerio.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.